Welcome to the Primetime Podcast. This is Primetime James Thomas coming at you with another edition of our Vince McMahon documentary breakdown. Um, and this will be the final video regarding this topic. Final review of the content, if you will. And this is Blurred Lines. Vince McMahon becoming Mr. McMahon and not really recognizing that the two have melded, and how he looks at himself and his legacy and what he has done. So this entire documentary is about Vince, and yet in some sense it's not really enough Vince McMahon in it. Clearly he stopped participating at some point in 2021 and 2022. And so the entire sixth episode is made up of talking heads talking about Vince, but basically talking about the issues surrounding Vince. And Vince is not there. But through the first five episodes, you get a really good sense of who Vince McMahon is as a cold, detached father, a cold, detached businessman, yet somebody who is passionate about defending his work and has a desire to enjoy himself and have fun with his creation. But you also get a sense that he's kind of like in a Michael Jackson, Willy Wonka type of situation. Now, if you want to go fiction, Willy Wonka is a great example. And if you want to go real life, Michael Jackson is a great example. Now you're thinking, now Vince, now James, how does Vince and Michael Jackson, how are they the same? These are people who are, very famous, mostly shut-ins, built their own world, where the oddball things that they do are normal to them and completely abnormal to other people. When you look at Michael Jackson's a really good example. And y'all know I'm a Michael Jackson guy. Michael Jackson is my favorite artist. But it's crazy how him and Vince got a lot. Him and Vince are a lot alike. Where Michael Jackson was abused as a kid, and essentially feeling like his childhood was taken away from him. And so, as an adult, he got to do the things that he never got to do as a child. They called it the Peter Pan syndrome, where he never really grew up. And so, when Michael Jackson started getting into legal troubles, you started seeing the you start seeing how different his world is from everybody else. Him having a pet monkey, having an amusement park in his backyard on his property. He lets children sleep in his bedroom. And you're like, what the hell is this? It was all very strange stuff. But strange to people on the outside. It's not strange to him. To him, this is always what he wanted to do. It's completely and totally innocent. It's not that big of a deal. If you ever seen the Willy Wonka movie, Willy Wonka is essentially a shut-in who lives in a castle, who makes candy all day, and he has little. I probably can't say the other word, but he has little people as servants, not slaves, but servants. And everything is edible in the house. You can lick the walls, you can eat the flowers, and all that kind of stuff. It's very strange, but you know, it's all about temptation to a degree. Willy Wonka is when he brings other people in and they're surrounded by temptation. There's candy everywhere. So you bring children in there, there's candy everywhere. Michael Jackson, similar thing. When you bring children in, there's everything a child could want there. And so, in a sense, WWE is kind of the same way. There's heroes, villains, and everything that child could imagine, right, exists within the world of WWE. And the person who created that world, even though he didn't technically create the company, he inherited / bought the company, but it was completely and totally remade under Vince McMahon. And as a guy who had a very rough childhood himself, The idea being that Vince created this world like he was the king, that he had full control and he could use people as pawns or rooks or bishops as he so desires. That that narrative takes over, and that becomes the dominant narrative of the documentary, is that Vince McMahon is cold and distant and basically manipulates and abuses people as he wishes. So that's one sort of perception of Vince McMahon that I noticed and that I understand. But there's another sort of, and it's still the same. It's along those lines of being distanced from reality, as Vince throughout the story kind of denies sort of basic reality. The abuse cycle. Vince was abused as a child. It's been reported that he was abused by his stepfather a lot, and that he was abused by his mother. And in sociology, there's the abuse cycle, where they cloak what they say is, hurt people, right? And Vince completely denies it. He basically says that it's not real. He has consistently said that's not real. So it's not like he's an old, demented man, but it's also in the Playboy article that he says that he doesn't view his childhood as an excuse for negative behaviors. And he also says this about Chris Benoit's CTE, where he basically says, no, Chris Benoit is just a monster. He just went nuts. He denies that CTE had any real connection to Chris Benoit's change in behavior. And so you see that he sort of had this extreme personal responsibility perception. And I can appreciate that, but you are a person who makes the decisions. You're not but to say that that past exposure to trauma or exposure to violence doesn't make you more comfortable with it and comfortable with things like confrontations, and that can decide how you end up in certain situations, or how you perceive the world. All that would be false. We all know people who are abused. They typically have some sort of psychological damage. They suffer through trauma as they go through life, especially if it's things they don't deal with. And we learn through this documentary that Vince has a lot of trauma that he went through as a young man: sexual abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse, that he just completely ignored. And people are not used to guys who were born in 1946 having interviews and talk about their backstories and not being inundated with that's how the world was, or I didn't know I didn't know I need to go to therapy. Therapy culture. They don't live through that. And so when you look at how Vince behaves and some of the things that he says, you tend to forget you're talking to a dinosaur pretty much. He's not one of these effeminate males who cries at movies and is as some of these male feminists out here. This is not who Vince McMahon is. These things are difficult for him to change through. When you're pitching the idea of a women's main event in WrestleMania or something like that, and he's resistant to it, it's not because he's a misogynist. The fucking guy was born in 1946. There was, during Vince's time, the idea of a woman, especially a black woman, main eventing the biggest show of the year, that in itself is crazy. So the fact that Vince was able to go through with that shows that he has the ability to adapt, and that adaptation allows him to reject certain things that are fundamentally true, such as he was abused as a youngster, and that maybe became a bit of a bully and abuser as he got older. As a way of dealing with confrontation or dealing with other people. And of course, this stuff is just armchair psychology. It's not real. We've sat down and talked with Vince, of course. In a previous episode, I kind of suggested that maybe Vince has some sort of neurological disorder of his own, that he was getting hit in the head with chairs and shovels and stuff like that, just like the boys were. And perhaps he may have some CTE or some sort of brain damage himself that may have affected his behavior. So in one of the episodes, I believe it was episode 6, he started talking about having two computers in his head, and that sometimes they work against him. And one of these computers is talking to you right now, and the other computer is thinking about having fun and lots of sex or something like that. And this is put in there, and it's weird, the placement of it, because this is the episode when they start talking about the sexual assault lawsuits and the NDAs and stuff like that. So it was primed to make you think that, okay, this guy's a freak. Again, to him, it's normal. And he says that he just wanted to be normal, but this is who he is, and he just has to deal with it. Again, you're talking about a situation where this guy was abused as a youngster, mentally and physically and sexually. It's causing some sort of damage in his thought process, his disorganized thoughts. But he deals with it. He has no time for therapy. Medication, forget about it. This is a guy who was born right around the Second World War. They didn't grow up in a world of, you have a problem, here's a pill. It was, no matter what your damage is, what your problem is, you're still responsible for yourselves. And you got to make better decisions. And that, of course, that kind of extreme ownership of everything, where you have all the excuses in the world, where guys like R. Kelly made these excuses. Well, I was abused as a kid, or whatever the case may be. It becomes an excuse when you do something wrong. But for Vince, he doesn't let it become an excuse. So he doesn't even let you defend him using that stuff. You can't be like, well, Vince was abused as a child, so maybe, he's an abuser as an adult, cycle of violence. Or, Vince probably has CTE in the chain of his behaviors, making him do weird things like grow a mustache and dye his hair. And you're like, no, because that's not what he would want. He wants to tell everybody what he did was not wrong, or he's not a bad person. But again, the Willy Wonka syndrome, the Michael Jackson syndrome, the stuff that you're doing is awkward. Having your daughter in sexual situations on television, yes, we know that in Hollywood, it's normal, but most of the average person is not in Hollywood. The average person cannot imagine putting their daughter in a sexual objectionable situation on television. The average person can't imagine you pitching the idea of being the father of your own daughter's child. These things are weird. These things are abnormal. But to him, he can laugh it off because to him it's a joke. But to everybody else, they're looking at it in the context of all the other stuff. So as you listen to Vince, the first thing I had to recognize is that, as I say on this channel, the obvious story is the one you could see. You're looking at a man who's almost 80 years old. So looking at a guy who has poured his entire life into this business. He's almost 80 years old. The concept that he might have trauma or some sort of brain damage or whatever due to steroid abuse, maybe drugs, alcohol, cocaine, getting the head in steel chairs, and all these sorts of things. That stuff comes along with him just being old. You already start having neurological difficulties as you age. But as you add on top of the fact that he used steroids for years, and add on top that he was abused as a child, then you add on top that he went into the business of falling down and getting hit with weapons. He might be a little different in his thought process, and a little different in terms of how he perceives the world. So that's just from a physical and psychological situation where he could control the violence that's directed towards him in WWE. So yes, he could put himself through these incredible humiliating situations where he's getting his hair cut. It's for our entertainment. He's pissing on himself for our entertainment. He's taking stunners and he's getting beat up by every wrestler in the world. Elbow drops from the top of the ladder. This is all violence that he can control, as opposed to what he couldn't control from his stepfather and from his mother, apparently. So that's just his childhood, as he's willing to share it. How it might affect his adulthood as he's willing to share it. But again, during his teen years, he's spending time with his dad, and they don't really have a close relationship. He talks about, the very few times his dad told him he loved him, and not enough hugs, not enough, emotion. Again, these are old men. If Vince was born near the end of the Second World War, imagine how old was his father? So these are not emotionally clingy men. This is a different world. These are different type of men, a different type of ways that they were raised into. And seemingly, from our understanding, his father never really had no real contact with him at all before the two of them met when Vince was 12. And that could shape a person. That can affect the person, especially it affects how they become as parents. Now, one of the things I've seen online is how people just juxtapose Vince and Shane. And they say, you look at Shane with his children, how close he is with them, how involved he is with them. And he kind of broke the cycle. Yeah, but Shane was born in the 70s when all that stuff started coming in about, cold, distant fathers and, therapy culture and all that type of stuff. This stuff didn't exist for Vince. That would have had to have been an adaptation. He was an adult by this time this stuff happened, had children of his own, had a business to run. That was incredibly time consuming. He's got to manage 200 other personalities. He didn't have time for this type of stuff, especially when he realizes that he really thinks he can work through it on his own, that he can do it himself. And he's got incredible pride and ambition and drive. And one of the other things I find that I keep hearing, he doesn't look backwards. He doesn't like to reflect. That could also be an interesting scenario when it comes to Vince, because what kind of person doesn't reflect on the past, doesn't think about how things could have been done better, differently? So he talks about not allowing failure to fester, which is a positive. Quite a few people, especially wrestling fans, who love to talk about how the XFL failed, or the hotel and the casino failed, and Ico Pro failed. They tried to do a boxing fight and that failed. And Evil Knievel failed. And all these business ventures ended up being a failure. And what I see, because of how he has a little bit of a different brain, is that he was an individual that would try a lot of different things. He was ambitious. Being a wrestling promoter was just one thing that he didn't, but Vince wanted to be a promoter of other things. He wanted to grow. And this is another big thing with Vince, is that he's 80 years old, but he doesn't feel like he's set in his ways, that he can't adapt, that there's no new challenges out there in life. And I respect that. I've always said this about Vince, is that there's a small part of me that kind of admires the old man, that respects the old man. Because old people, especially when they're at the age Vince is at, they're already at that time. They're at that point in their life, and they're like, I already done it. I did it. I'm sitting in the laps of luxury, enjoying the fruits of my labor. And he's kind of like, well, no, I'm still alive. Today is a different day to do something different. Let's try this. Let's try that. And if you have success in one realm, you do try to use that success in other realms. The problem with that is Vince McMahon's Willy Wonka. He's Michael Jackson in a sense. He tries to turn everything into what the thing that he already has is. He tries to turn football into WWF, restaurants into WWF, bodybuilding into the WWF. And that stuff doesn't work across other genres. And it doesn't work in other industries. The Vince McMahon flavor of entertainment doesn't work outside of the WWF, and maybe that was his ego that made him think, well, everybody else loves everything else I do. Let's put my spin on this or my spin on that. And there's some elements of positive to it, yes, because again, it's ambitious. And you should always try to do something different with your life. But to other people on the outside, you're just racking up L's. You tried that, and you tried this and that, and it didn't work. But to him, it's like I tried these other things because I was in a position to try all these things. The number one wrestling promoter, making money hand over fist. I got money to waste on casinos. I got money to waste on hotels and football leagues. I got money to waste on my wife running for office. Because you're successful, you could do more. And that's the fundamental nature of the capitalist country, is that if you're successful in one venture, you can branch out. Now, I wish you would have branched out and been a little bit more charitable instead of trying to recreate the NFL. But, he doesn't allow failure to fester. But that's the one positive thing that I could say is he's incredibly ambitious. And that's very inspiring because you really don't see a lot of very ambitious people in the world. Most people are extremely happy, having one stream of income, one thing that they're good at, and that's that. You want to get rich quick scheme, and that's that. Not looking to build anything. They just want to jump in while it's already built and keep the machine going. And when you look at what Vince did with the WWF, he completely remade it. When people talk about how he got the company, he had a sweetheart deal, yada, yada, yada. In 3 years, it was a completely different company. He took something that already existed and restructured it, essentially. That's why he keeps up this narrative about the smoky building, cigar chomping audience, because to him, that's what it was. It wasn't the bright lights. It wasn't the big city. It wasn't mainstream. It wasn't Hollywood. It wasn't New York. There weren't tons of celebrities and all this type of stuff. This was his vision of the pro wrestling space. And while it's not historically accurate, you're still talking about somebody who, again, Willy Wonka, Michael Jackson, Hugh Hefner is another good one. But he created his own reality where he's king shit and he makes the rules. So that's all very interesting. Vince being inspired by Dr. Jerry Graham, and this kind of he's using that as a blueprint to form his wrestling character. Vince is sort of inspirational. Him drawing inspiration from Dr. Jerry Graham is a known story. When you look at Jerry Graham, another one of those proto Ric Flair kind of guys, big money, big and muscular, blonde, strutting, charismatic. Vince always looked up to him. Spent a little bit of time with him as a wrestler in the 50s. Didn't get to spend a lot of time with him, but he made an impression of Vince. And Vince was always kind of like, that's who I wanted to be. He wanted to be a wrestler. And he tells a little bit of the story of his dad telling him, don't get into the wrestling space. His dad forbade him to become a wrestler. But once his dad was gone, and now it's 1998, and there's a perception out there that Vince is the worst person in the world because of what happened with Brett. Because of, if you're in the know in '98, the Rita Chatterton thing, and there's the Ring Boy scandal, a bunch of heat on Vince already in '98. So there's no longer a need for a surrogate, in Ted DiBiase, which is kind of I hate to use an anime thing, but it's kind of like a Kami Piccolo situation where Vince split himself into Vince McMahon and Ted DiBiase. And Ted DiBiase went on to make all this money as $1 million man and live that lifestyle that Vince saw with Dr. Jerry Graham. And had another wrestler live that lifestyle, well, now he's like, I don't have to do that anymore. I can reinsert myself. I can do that. Now I can be the $1 million man because that's what I am anyway. The character is basic on him. So why don't he just do it? Now he's an on-screen character unwillingly to a degree because of the Bret Hart situation. But now there's a ton of heat on Vince. And since Ted DiBiase is based on him anyway, and Ted DiBiase is gone, well, I have to reinsert. He has to reinsert that. Now he gets to be the $1 million man, but it's more real to him because he was the $1 million man anyway. So you got this fully formed corporate monster, and he has to find new ways of abusing the talent and treating people like shit. And it comes easy to him because he knows, as he says, the kind of people he doesn't like. He grew up poor. He said rich people always have this I'm better than you mentality. So that's what he did, And so some people tend to believe that this persona is how he really is. And because people believed it, the character is believable. And because Vince McMahon is constantly talking about how having affairs, and then when Vince starts kissing on the girls, it becomes believable. And you look at this sort of thing like, now we're looking at everything with fresh eyeballs, tainted through sex trafficking lawsuits, and we're looking at situations where we're saying, by God, he did angles with Trish and did angles with Ashley, did angles with Maria, angles with Stacy Keibler and Sable and all these other different women on television. And is he just acting out his fantasies? To a degree, yes. To a degree, absolutely he is. But it's fiction. It's not real. It's no different than when Quentin Tarantino puts himself into the movie, or no different when Spike Lee puts himself into the movie. But you're in a situation where you're looking at this guy as an incredibly evil and using his power and authority to act out his sexual fantasies. But at the same time, in the same way, this is what the character is openly doing. He's openly being lustful with these young women because that's what he feels a rich person, in some cases like a Hugh Hefner, would do. And unfortunately, it's very true because you see this one a lot with Bill Cosby, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, Puffy. All these people are sex pests, and Vince is now among them, right? But in a sense, that is what the on-screen version of Mr. McMahon is based on, if it's not based on reality. But there's going to be some reality in it because of the circumstances are still real. He's not just playing a rich and powerful man on television. That is what he is in real life. He's not just playing their boss on television. That is what he is in real life. So it is an interesting scenario, but just like Spike Lee wrote himself to be a love interest in a movie, Vince McMahon writes himself to be a love interest on screen. And people have problems separating those two. While Vince doesn't feel like he does, some people feel like he does. Others feel like, okay, you're getting lost in the sauce, you're living the gimmick. And it is an interesting scenario because it's probably going to take a long time before we finally figure it out. whether he's living the gimmick or which is all the evidence lean towards that he is, and at some point, Mr. McMahon took over the real Vince McMahon's personality, and that's just who he is all the time now. And this guy who is, in a sense, eternally young, much like Vince McMahon himself, he doesn't really get old. And I bet he felt old at one time. That's why he wanted to kill the character off in 2007. But it was because he started feeling old, started looking old. There wasn't enough hair dye in the world to cover all the grays. And the character had kind of maxed out in terms of what it could do. So he tried to kill the character off and just be more off screen. It didn't really work out that way. It took a little bit longer before Triple H and Stephanie were mature enough to take over as characters. But that seemed to be the goal, that at one point he was trying to kill Mr. McMahon. He was trying to get that character off television. And that needs to be taken into account too, because what made him decide enough, Mr. McMahon? We've seen it. We've done enough. But there's still so much of it there that he popped back up to do something with Kevin Owens. Or he would pop up and do something with Randy Orton or Roman Reigns. He'll pop back up to do something with AJ Styles. So the character still has some life. And he would pop back up in his last year, his grand goodbye, to do things with Austin Theory and Pat McAfee. Mix up and all that with Stone Cold Steve Austin one more time. And that had a great deal of nostalgia, but it often comes across as the last gasp of a man who thought he would live forever, finding out he's very much mortal. At the same time, though, excuse me, there's still a beating heart in that body, and there's still so much that he feels he has to do or stuff that he can do, and sometimes he overrates his own capabilities. Like when he really botched that stunner at WrestleMania 38, he really ruined that thing. And maybe he thought he could take a stunner. He thought he could take a stunner at that time when he was like, 73, 74 years old. He thought he could take a stunner still. Well, to be fair, he never really could take a stunner. But compared to how he used to take it back in the 90s, compared to that WrestleMania, 9-day difference. Ooh, his body completely shut down. But he thought he could take a stunner after having a match. But no, his body gave out. He still had fun doing it. And that's the part of Vince that lives in, that we see. And when we hear that he still has a ton of energy as an older guy who's almost 80. He still works out, still goes to the gym, still jacked. And you're like, how could this be? Then you realize that he says this over and over again. He has an incredible zest for life. That's his reaction. That's why he still thinks about sex. Part of this could be steroid usage. Part of it could be hormonal imbalances, some sort of brain damage whatsoever. But his zest for life leads him to save things like he doesn't believe in retirement. And that makes, again, normal people look like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, dude, you're way beyond the age of retirement. And Vince, when they talk about succession, they've been talking about successions long before any of this stuff happened. He never really got into the subject. He never sat down and planned what would happen if he wasn't going to be there, because he never planned to not be there. That was the thing, and everybody knew that. Everybody says Vince is going to die in that chair. There's not a succession plan. The succession plan is you figure it out when I'm gone. That was the plan. Because he never planned to stop. And I like how he phrased it. He phrased it by saying, either you're growing or you're dying. So he has no sympathy for people who retire. He says, go die. Because at that point, You're not working anymore. You're not evolving. You're not adapting. You're not doing anything new. You're just rotting away. But it sounds weird to the average person, but that's it. It's facts. It's absolute facts what he said. That's real shit what he said. If the plant isn't growing, it's dying. If the human being isn't growing, it's dying. When you stop growing, you hit your peak and you start to regress and your skin starts to wrinkle, you're not growing anymore. You hit your physical peak and now you're starting to degrade actually. But it sounds weird to people who want and look forward to being 65 and sitting around with their social security and going to an old folks home whatsoever. That's what they're looking forward to. But Vince is different. He doesn't look at it that way. He's not looking forward to that. He doesn't want that. So in a sense, he's trying to force himself to be young forever. Much like, again, fictional characters. That he doesn't change. He never changes. And this is why he dyed his hair and grew that stupid looking mustache to try to look somewhat younger. And it's not going to work. He has to come to grips with his own mortality. He has to come to grips with reality. He's got to stop living the gimmick. He has fallen into Ric Flair territory. Ric Flair still, woo, wheeling dealing, son of a gun, limousine riding, jet flying at 70-something years old. And when you see Ric Flair, and he's in these commercials and whatsoever, he's wooing, and he could barely move, and you get a sense, this is a shell of Ric Flair. Why don't this guy just stop doing this and go away? And y'all know me, I'm a Ric Flair guy. But even I'm at that point where I'm like, dude, just enjoy your life. Hell, that's probably why him and Ric Flair got along so well, because they have the same ideology about life. That's probably the biggest reason why him and Ric Flair always got along. Like you could say the same thing about Vince. Like, just stop, just go away. And Vince is like, if I go away, what will I do? Just go be a granddad? I mean, hell, even his grandchildren are adults now. So what is he supposed to do? Except you're telling him to go into a hole and lay down and die. And he's not willing to do that. He's not willing to go away. He's not willing to give up his playground. He's not willing to come to grips with reality that he is a man who's almost 80 years old. And these situations that he finds himself in are very weird. And the world that he created, the bubble has been pierced to a degree. And now everything is coming across as awkward. And this is what happens. For years, it's like not to overly equate these two things, but Diddy's talked about having these parties for over 20 years, how famous his parties were. And now the government has turned the freak-off parties into a criminal activity. So now when you look at Puffy talk about parties in 1999, you're like, ugh. You know? Now when you hear Puffy talk about throwing parties in 1995, you're like, ugh. When it was probably completely innocent. Everybody went to a Diddy party. It takes on a new terminology. It takes on a new thought process with time. And a lot of stuff Vince McMahon did on screen takes on a different context once people start saying, oh, you're a sex trafficker or you're a rapist. And you see that in the perception of how some people are looking at the Attitude Era now. Oh, when Vince is doing stuff with Trish Stratus or he's doing something with Sable whatsoever. Oh, this is sexual harassment. He was throwing it in our faces the entire time like it's found knowledge. When in reality, it's still the same thing it was yesterday. You're just looking at it through a different lens on purpose, mind you. Like, we don't know at one point Diddy's party went from went just being industry soirees to being cult sex rituals whatsoever. We don't know when that happened. And we're not sure when Mr. McMahon took over Vince McMahon and he started trying to use the roster or even some of the women working in the office, even though he was already having sex with some of the women in the office. I think he had an affair with a secretary in the 80s. But we don't know when he started turning that into the Playboy Mansion, where all these women were for his personal use. We don't know when that started. But from a documentary perspective, I really like hearing that this guy doesn't give up. He's not just gonna go sit on a porch with his dog and drink orange juice every morning and not live his life. I really enjoy, because I've seen older people and what they really do is just sit, look out the window, and nobody talks to them, nobody cares about them. And when you see that kind of reality, you should appreciate somebody like Vince McMahon who's active. But then you want to say, how active should an 80-year-old man be? He shouldn't be having 40-year-old lovers, maybe. Maybe that's a little too active. At the same time, is it better for him to go sit and rot somewhere? No, it's not. There has to be a happy marriage between the two. So another question that they asked him about his legacy, and he said he doesn't feel like he has one. And I don't know whether he was being humble here or was it he just doesn't think about it, because again, he has this sort of sense of he's immortal, or he doesn't really care what people think about him. And he might legitimately be living his life in a way where he doesn't care what people think. And if that's the case, then he wouldn't be trying to protect his legacy. He doesn't really care about what it is, or I think he said on Pat McAfee that, he can't change people's perspective of him, where he think he's a bad person, and it is what it is. And he said in a documentary about the Rita Chatterton situation that once people think you're a rapist, then you're a rapist. He doesn't try to fight those perceptions, but he doesn't argue with people about it, And it's also a very weird thing, because you would think that, and back in the day, he did sue Rita Chatterton over it, but then he dropped the case. So it's not one of those things where he's just let that linger in the universe for years unrecognized. He planned to do something about it, but then, the Ring Boy scandal, steroid scandal, all that stuff popped up around the same time, and he needed to save himself some money. So why waste the time and the money suing Rita Chatterton and Geraldo Rivera? It's just, there's levels of importance. Dealing with the Ring Boy scandal was more important than that, because it affected the company. And as we know through this documentary, Vince loves the company more than he loves himself. And taking care of the steroid trial to keep himself out of prison, was more important than Rita Chatterton calling him a rapist on television, because his freedom was at stake. So when he was talking about being on trial for steroids and kind of going after the government, talk about the Department of Justice, how the Department of Justice are kind of shitty and all that kind of stuff. That was another one of those things where I was like, this old dude, he has so much fight in him. And the government offered him a plea and he refused to take it because he doesn't believe he did anything wrong. But at the same time, as he got older, of course, this became more of a problem. As he still doesn't believe he did anything wrong in any of these situations with these women that he paid out, and he maybe didn't do the math on how much money he paid out with the settlements or non-disclosure agreements. Maybe he didn't do the math on it, but he had so much money, he probably didn't pay attention. But again, when you look at it from the outside, you're like, it's $12 million. It's kind of ridiculous. But to him, if it kept his name out of the media and, it didn't embarrass his wife, which he cares a lot about, he cares about not embarrassing Linda. And this was something that, of course, he said in the Playboy interview. They were talked about having affairs, and he talked about being discreet and not wanting to rub that stuff in Linda's face. So at the time, that's what he figured he was doing. He's going to pay these girls to be quiet and not talk about it, not write any books about it, not do any interviews about it. And it comes across as, again, people can't read in the A's, we don't know what's in them, that these are all sexual assaults. These are all rapes, even though nobody said that. It's just that that's the perception. And Vince doesn't fight that perception. So I guess he would fight these things individually. But the idea that he's discreet when it comes to Linda and his sexual activities, he'll live out his fantasies on television because, again, it's just not real. But then there's the element of him actually being sexually active in real life and the blurring of the two. And of course, Janelle Grant's attorneys are talking about there's no difference between the two. Well, in court, you're not going to show a video of Vince McMahon making out with Sable and saying that in a way proves he's a sex trafficker. I'm pretty sure you're going to have to show footage, legit footage or evidence of him sex trafficking in real life over sex trafficking on television or whatsoever, maybe. So it's an interesting scenario that you're dealing with when you're dealing with Vince. And he's not sure what his legacy is because he doesn't reflect too much. He doesn't have regrets. He says he doesn't regret anything he's done in his life because in his mind, he thinks he never did anything wrong. So, of course, when you look back in history at Owen Hart falling from the ceiling, you would think that would be something he would regret. And he says he has no regrets because you can't change any of those things. And that's true fundamentally. But like I said in a previous installment in the series, people want to hear human reactions. They want to hear an 80-year-old man sit back and say, you know what? A guy died in the ring. I really wish we didn't put that stunt together. You know? It's really sad. I wish we hadn't done it. But when you say I have no regrets, the people are like, wow. Not even the guy falling from the ceiling? You don't have regrets about that? And I understand you can't live your life second guessing your every move. But for human's sake, people want to hear you say a guy died that shouldn't have died. Or that some situations occurred I wish hadn't happened. But when you say you have no regrets and that you don't reflect on the past, that you don't let failure, allow failure to fester, it makes you come across as deeply, deeply, deeply detached from reality to the point where you live in a fictional world where these people are not real and they're just characters. And characters come and they go. Owen Hart was a character that fell from the ceiling. Now that character is gone. That is not what people want to hear. That makes you sound psychotic. When you see everybody say that he's evil, that sounds evil. That sounds like that you don't care about other human beings. And if you don't care about other human beings, of course you will abuse women. Of course you would be abusive towards talent. Of course you would, pay them the low market rate or whatever the case may be. You wouldn't pay them the pro rate. You would exploit people because you have no function of understanding humanity. This was a big miss in terms of humanizing Vince. Vince was more humanized on Pat McAfee when he was sort of reflective. And he seemed a lot more looser with Pat than he was in this documentary. So if you're trying to get a sense of who Vince McMahon is, this documentary didn't do him any favors. That's why I think it's deceptive. In editing, no, because part of it is what Vince is saying and what he thinks, and that other people responded. It's not just, they deceptively edited to make him look bad. It's also Vince says things that makes him look bad. you know? And maybe those are deceptively edited. His comments, perhaps, we don't know. But the documentary did not give you too much about Vince McMahon, the man. You know, you get a lot about the character, get a lot about the situations he finds himself in and his reactions to those situations, but they're not human reactions. You know, the only time he gets emotional is when he talks about his father passing. Other than that, he's basically trying to explain situations and not giving you any insight into his thought process about why he didn't close the show for Owen Hart. He just kind of responds to it. Well, people didn't come to see anybody die. They came to see a show. But it's like, but Vince, like, humanize this thing a little bit. The guy fell from the goddamn ceiling. They want to hear your thought process about why the show went on. When you hear about the wrestlers dying, we want you to reflect a little bit. Recognize how difficult the schedule might be. How these guys work through injuries. This is what we want to hear. But he doesn't say what, because he doesn't care about what you want to hear. And that's what makes him sound worse. And maybe that's how he really feels, is that he has no responsibilities for these guys who died. That's not his problem. These guys did things on their own time. In his mind, they're independent contractors. More so, they're full-grown adults, and they're responsible for their own actions and their safety and their own behaviors, which circles back to an extreme self-ownership that Vince McMahon essentially was talking about, where he won't allow himself the blame of any negative behaviors that falls on his abuse as a child. He doesn't allow Chris Benoit the excuse of CTE. So he's not going to allow the Mr. Perfects of the world or the Eddie Guerreros of the world the excuse of, oh, the wrestling business drove me to painkillers and die. And to be quite honest, that's inhuman. It's completely inhuman, because when a bunch of wrestlers are clocking out at 40, somebody should wake up and say, well, look, this is problematic. It's the lifestyle of the performers. There's too many guys for it to be just a personal failing. It has to be the lifestyle of the culture around the business. And some of these guys, because they're all in the same age bracket when they died, they come from the same era where the drugs and the steroids was more prevalent. And it was the culture time young at that time. And that's something that you would be willing to reflect on and mention and talk about. But Vince doesn't do that, because you didn't see a bunch of wrestlers dying at 40 before 1980. It wasn't a ton of wrestlers clocking out from heart attacks at 40. It started during the rock and wrestling era. It started in the 80s, where people started doing cocaine and painkillers recreationally. And there was an entire culture of wrestlers that was doing that. In Texas, Gino Hernandez, the Von Erich started doing drugs and all a bunch of stuff there. It was happening all over the country. Junkyard Dog came in from Louisiana, had a drug problem. So it was prevalent in the 80s and the 90s for these guys to experiment with drugs and alcohol to keep up the schedules so that they could work. That was the culture of the time. You're being asked this question, and if you're Vince, you should reflect on it. But because he's not a human being, maybe he's a guy with multiple computers in his head, like he says, he's getting defensive about it. And now he's 80, and he's still kind of defensive about it. And that's not really helpful. When everybody was scared of the documentary was going to humanize him, and that the documentary would make him seem like a normal, average guy. But it just showed how abnormal Vince McMahon really is. A piercing of the veil, where you see that the thought process of the world of Vince McMahon is not the same. as the thought process of the world of normal people. That he is in the realm of Michael Jackson and Willy Wonka and Hugh Hefner, who have crafted their own realities from our own reality, and we don't understand anything that's going on in there. And when somebody steps out and says, there's a lot of foul stuff going in there, we tend to believe it. We tend to look and be like, you know what, you're probably right. And while it's perfectly normal to them, what's going on in there, it ain't normal to us. And Vince McMahon is abnormal. Look at it from the outsider's perspective. If you lived with him for 40, 50 years, you're probably like, oh, that's just kind of how Vince is. But other people who don't know him, and this documentary was supposed to be about getting to know him, and he denies you the access of knowing who he is. He won't talk about his childhood. There's a bunch of things that he will not discuss, that he won't share. You know, he even laughs at not telling people real stories about things that happened to him or things that he was involved with. You come across with only what he wants you to see, and that he is cold, distant, and abnormal. And that's reason enough for people to be like, he should be in prison. You can't walk away from this thing thinking, oh, he's a kindly, that you can't walk away from this thing thinking, oh, this kindly old grandfather, there's no way he could possibly have done these things to this 40-year-old woman, Janelle Grant, in this lawsuit. You're looking at it from a perspective of he's 70-something years old. He still thinks about sex. He still goes to the gym. He still works out. He's in better shape than most 80-year-old men. And you're like, I can see it, you know? You're putting the thought in people's heads that you are what the public perception of you is. And that's because you have blurred the lines and you've fallen into the gimmick. And now Mr. McMahon is all the people will see, and they will never see Vince McMahon, the man. So that concludes my breakdown of the Mr. McMahon documentary. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this breakdown. Please hit that like and subscribe button and leave your thoughts in the comment section. This is Primetime James Thomas signing off. Have a good day. Talk to you later.